Hello everyone, and welcome to the Paul Chandler Show. I'm your host, Paul Chandler. Today we're going to be discussing diabetes and the documentation requirements to be able to choose the correct coding. Now, the diabetes section in the ICD-10 book is what I call the carbon copy section. So for those of you who do not remember what carbon copy paper is, you're probably the person who knows the pound symbol as a hashtag. So if you've never heard of the phrase pound symbol before, like on a phone with cords, probably don't know what carbon copied is. So if you were like me, and actually let me rephrase that. I cannot confirm nor deny if you would, like me as a kid, and you may have had your own seat at the principal's office in grade school, and you got to the point where you called him John instead of Mr. Grunder because you saw him so much. Carbon copy paper, which would happen if they had to write a note home to your parents, it was the white and like the pink and then like the yellow where you write on one and it would go through the rest. That's where carbon copy paper is and what I refer to as the diabetes section. Because in the code book, there's a lot of different sections, categories as we call them. And I'm going to be showing you a way how to easily, if you know how to do one format, one category of ICD-10 in the diagnosis coding for diabetes, then you can be able to grasp the concepts of all of them. So today we're talking about diabetes and the documentation requirements for each of the sections. When we're coding diabetes in the code set, I need to memorize how it is carbon copied a lot. First, we need to look at the categories, or the first three characters of the code. So diabetes goes from E08 through E13. And just to remind everyone, I did not write the ICD-10 book. So if things do not look like they're common sense to you, that's because they're not. So we have E08 through E13. So dealing with categories, first we have E08, diabetes due to underlying condition. So I'll just put UND-COND for underlying condition. Then we have E09, diabetes due to drug or chemically induced. So drug or chemical. E10, type 1 diabetes. E11, type 2 diabetes. We skip E12. Think of that as a save it for a later spot. So then just in case, if they do add a new type of diabetes classification, then stick it right here in E12. And then E13, other specified. Now, one issue though that we have when we are coding diabetes is, for one, remember how to spell unspecified. Live TV, ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing like it. So when we're looking at the different categories, some issues though where it gets complicated first is that generally in the E10, E11, because notice though that E10 is for type 1, E11 is for type 2, now the E12 is a save it for later spot. And that's where, again, the common sense does not make actually even sense to me at all, because why do they not make type 1 diabetes, E11, type 2 diabetes, E12, so that way we're syncing up the 1 and the 11, the 2 and the 12, and save the E10 spot for later. So that's one thing we have to remember also. So that's a tricky thing number one. And tricky thing number two is, you notice the E13, how it says other specified. Not unspecified, but other specified. So if we do not know the main cause or the root of the diabetes, nor do we know if it's a type 1 or type 2, so that means it would remain unspecified at that point, then we consider it to be a type 2. So I'll do UNSPEC for unspecified. So just think of that as whenever we have to essentially assume or guess based on the documentation requirements, that always have the phrase that we default to the healthier status of a patient. So between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, healthier status of the patient. So then once we figure out which category we're in, where I mentioned as far as the carbon copying is dealing with the 4th, 5th, 6th, and if I have to build up to 7 characters. So no matter which category you are looking at, dealing with the classifications of those 4th characters. So let's just say, for example, let's say that we are in, let's just say E11. So like a type 2 diabetes. So we'll be looking at the 4th characters all the way down. So starting with E11.1, for example, diabetes or type 2 diabetes mellitus. And actually remembering though that diabetes and diabetes mellitus is also the same thing, just a different way to say it. And also the acronym DM. So for example, DM2 equals diabetes type 2. So starting with the E11.0, we have diabetes type 2 with hyposmolarity. And with the hypersmolarity, this is one I actually always double check on the spelling, just to make sure I don't mess it up. Molarity. So E11.0 for the type 2 diabetes with hypersmolarity, E11.1 with type 2 diabetes with ketoacidosis. And this is another one of those big fancy medical words I always make sure I'm spelling right. Acidosis. E11.2, type 2 diabetes with kidney complications. So now we're transferring into different organs. So kidney complications, or E11.3 with ophthalmic complications. And I'm trying not to write like a doctor, but I kind of force a habit sometimes. So E11.3, type 2 diabetes with ophthalmic complications. And then E11.4, still crossing over as far as different organ systems, but now we have neuro complications. E11.5 is circulatory complications. E11.6 with other specified complications. And we're concluding then the different category types that we have for the 4th characters. E11.7 is a save it for later spot. Just if they decide to link the complications with another organ system, perhaps. And the E11.8 with unspecified complications. And E11.9 without complications. So where the carbon copying comes in is that take a few moments, by chance, pause this video if you like, or go back in later, look at the E08, E09, E10, and E13. And all of these, the 0.0 through the 0.9s, when they apply, they're all the same. So for example, E08.4 is dealing with neural complications for diabetes due to underlying conditions. And E10.4 for type 1 diabetes with neural complications. So that's why, yes, in the coding book, it can look very overwhelming, but that's just because we have all the different categories now in diagnosis coding for diabetes, but the E0 through, let's say the E11.0 through the E11.9, they're all the same. Except though, if there are going to be any ones that are different, then it would most likely be these two. The hyposmolarity and the ketoacidosis. Not every category, the E08 through E13 has those options, but they all do have the 0.2 through the 0.9. And two other things to watch out for is, if you notice as far as the documentation requirements, usually the unspecified codes end in a 9, and the other specified codes end in an 8. Watch out on the diabetes though, because the other specified is a 6 instead of the 8, and the unspecified is an 8 instead of a 9, because we have to have a diabetes without any complications. That's why that ends up being on the 9 down there. So this is one of the few times where the other specified and unspecified codes are different numbers in there. And then one other thing to notate, that if you were to look at the documentation requirements, that a type 1 diabetic patient, they require insulin to live. That's just how a type 1 diabetes patient is. Type 2 diabetic patient may or may not be on insulin, all depending on the situation. So notice that the coding for the documentation requirements for E11 for type 2 diabetes, we do have the use additional code options, the Z79.4 and the Z79.84. Those just all depend on the patient having insulin, Z79.4, or some type of oral medication, Z79.84. Those are very things that are important to look at in your documentation, because if patient has a type 2 diabetes and if there's no mention of the insulin use or oral medications, we do not use the additional code. But if they do have it, then you use the code. On type 1 diabetes, the E10, we do not have those additional code option rules that use additional code for insulin or oral medication, because the patient, they're gonna be on insulin or medication to be able to stay alive. So because that's a requirement, that is why we don't code it. So that is simply just because it's assumed that the patient is on one of those. So with the different documentation requirements, watch out for the E08 through E13. Make sure you know what category that you're dealing with, and then just knock it down based on the fourth character, what type of section that we're in, and remembering the use additional code rule for the type 2 diabetes, the E11s. I do thank you for watching this educational video on diabetes and coding documentation requirements. Have an awesome rest of the day. If you like this video and want to see more, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's so easy. It's right there. A little button. Just push it. Subscribe. I got all night. Nothing else to do. Just subscribe.